Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the latest installment of the Lindamood-Bell Leaders in Literacy webinar series. I'm Dave Kivita, the Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools, and I've got the pleasure of being joined today by Peter Kosko, who is the Assistant Director of Exceptional Student Education in Rock Hill Public Schools and Rock Hill, South Carolina. And so, Peter, thanks for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you for you to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Peter Kosko, Assistant Director for Exceptional Student Education. That's just our fancy word here in Rock Hill for special education. It's the beginning of my fourth year here in Rock Hill, and previously I spent 16 years down in Aiken, South Carolina, near Augusta, Georgia. So doing various things down there. Was a special ed teacher for many years, and then went into administration as an assistant principal at high school, and also then became compliance administrator for the district of Aiken. So before coming here to be assistant director. So.
Got it. Great. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun working with you over the past couple of years to get this project really up and going and out into the schools. And I'm hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the background just of Rock Hill as a district overall, and then we can talk more into kind of the specifics of how you came to partnering with Lindamood-Bell and what all of that looked like. So maybe if you just start big picture first.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a little bit about Rock Hill. We're about 15 to 20 miles south of the city of Charlotte. We're one of the largest suburbs of the city of Charlotte. And, we're in South Carolina, though, just barely. Got about 18,000 students in the district. And of that, we've got almost 3,000 special ed students. So we're a little bit high on that population. There's a variety of reasons. We've got a pretty high rate of poverty compared to many of the other suburbs. We got a little bit more affordable housing with gentrification of Charlotte, and then the two school districts just north of us on the actual North Carolina border being a little more affluent. We have some flight from the city that kind of settles here. So it brings with it several challenges. So that's kind of the reason, or some of the reasons for the high percentage of disabilities. But we're a relatively large school district, 11th largest out of 89 school districts in the state of South Carolina.
Great. And, Peter, you and I talked for a long time and did a lot of work together going into year one. But there were a lot of things that sort of drove the inception of the project, I guess.
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about what was happening in the state as a whole and what was going on in Rock Hill that kind of, made you start the journey of looking to bring some additional literacy instruction into special ed, and then kind of how you ended up selecting Lindamood-Bell as being the organization that you wanted to partner with to provide professional development to your teachers.
Yeah, so I actually started in Rock Hill at a fortuitous time. The state of South Carolina just settled with the federal government in a lawsuit, kind of dating back to the last decade, right after the Great Recession. State of South Carolina did across-the-board funding cuts, which violated the maintenance of fiscal efforts that states have to abide by via special education law, federal regulations. And so punishment, so to speak, is the feds cut your funding, and it's a forever cut, because that's what makes sense. Is take money away from the children. But so state of South Carolina actually won the lawsuit stating there was no discrimination against students with disabilities. That was really the purpose of that portion of the law, was to prevent states from discriminating against children with disabilities. And so we won that lawsuit. It was about $86 million we got from the feds, and each of the school districts got apportioned funds based on their student populations and a few other factors as well. So we got a pretty nice chunk, and we had some pretty strict guidelines on how we had to spend that money based on the actual settlement with the feds. And so part of that was we had to look at some of our weaknesses as a school district, special ed wise, and address those specifically with the funds. And we couldn't address more than a certain number, but we had to address at least one major portion. And for us, reading was a significant issue for our students with disabilities. The gap between those students on the state assessments versus students in general. At the same time, we've had a couple of pieces, at that time it was just one piece of legislation, but since then we've had a second piece of legislation targeting dyslexia. And so with that push, the dyslexia push, the problem that we had in our district with our significant gap between disabled and non-disabled students on reading achievement kind of directed me to start researching what programs were out there, what methodologies, what could we do to address it that had some scientific backing, because that was also a heavy piece in directing us how to spend those funds. It couldn't just be pull something off the shelf and let's throw it in there. There had to be some science to back it up. And and that kept coming back to Lindamood-Bell and having some outside testing, not just using your own folks to do it. And so that was impressive. And the effect size was a very, very big selling point to us, because I wanted to make sure we made a difference.
Yeah. And so then we kind of jumped into year one. Well, I wouldn't say we jumped into year one. Actually, we did a ton of preparation. We trained a bunch of teachers over the course of the summer, not just in terms of what the programs are, so seeing stars for decoding and visualizing and verbalizing for language comprehension, but also in how to provide assessments to students so that they could get them really grouped effectively based on where their strengths and weaknesses actually lay, so that they could get the right remediation. And, we talked a lot about what kind of structures of ongoing support we wanted to put into place. And so part of the project was about not just doing the initial training, but for Lindamood-Bell to provide ongoing support throughout the whole school year. And I know that there were a couple of things that stood out to you from sort of year one, and maybe there are even some things that you might have ended up doing somewhat differently as you look back at year one. So maybe you can speak to some of that.
Yeah. Well, one thing I did that I would have done, I would do it again if I had to do it, was started small. I did not start with the entire school district because I wanted to kind of be very deliberate, very small, very targeted, so that we could get it right, with the goal of expanding. So we really narrowed it down to schools that volunteered, that demonstrated they were able to jump into this project with us, that said they were willing to do it, that were ready. We did kind of limit the scope of students that we were targeting, pretty specifically to children with not just with reading disabilities, but children that did kind of fit that dyslexia model. So that it was a very, very narrow view the first year. Now, that's the one part of that I might have changed, or probably would change in the future, is I would still do it very small, very make sure people had the capacity to implement, that they were on board with doing it and volunteering, but I probably would not have narrowed it to looking just at that dyslexia group the first year, knowing that that wasn't where I was going to be my end game. Because the backfire on that was, and to a certain degree still, is changing some misconceptions. Folks that thought, oh, this is only for children with dyslexia.
Right.
Everybody else, no, we can't do Lindamood-Bell with them.
Yeah, one of the things I think about with that sometimes is, we've talked about this too, is how many groups a day teachers are then running, which dictates how much opportunity they have to practice
Right.
utilizing a program. And so the more students they've got that they're implementing it with, the more practice they actually get. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, that's one of those things I probably would have changed a little bit differently. And then another one is, I would have spent a little bit more time. I focused more on teacher buy-in that very first year. I think I'd put a little more time in on the admin buy-in. Because I did that kind of on the back end. I would change that.
Yeah, I was going to ask if that was like when you say it was voluntary at the school level and they demonstrated they were ready to do it. You were thinking mainly at that point about the teachers demonstrating that they're ready to do it.
Right, exactly. And that's just one of those things. You live, you learn.
Sure. Yeah. And so, all those things said, year one went, I think, pretty well. What were some things that you were seeing coming out of year one, and thinking about heading into year two?
Well, in year one, we saw some significant growth with our students who were in there. And so, we knew we were on the right track. And so we did decide we were going to expand. My original plan was always to do K-8. And I'm a former high school teacher and administrator. So I kind of I thought in high school, just knowing the structure of high school, it might be a difficult battle. But our high schools, they were chomping at the bit, ready to dive into this, bugging me. And so I said, you know what? Hey, if you want it that bad, let's go down that road. So we did decide to include them and go with the K-12 approach for year two. Now, year one, we did have a boots on the ground coach from you guys who did a great job. But when expanding to the entire school district, that just became not feasible. We would have had to have, in order to make it feasible, we would have had to have more than one coach, and then it would have been not feasible from the financial side of things.
Yeah.
So we moved to the online coaching, which I will admit, although I feel like I'm a man of the 21st century, I was a little apprehensive because I'd never experienced that level of online coaching.
Yeah.
And because it was pretty significant. We've got tons and tons of teachers out there, dozens that were getting it. But I will have to say, I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. It was a hit. And I might have even done a little more of that the first year had I realized it was going to be such a big hit.
Yeah. And when you say it was a hit, how so? What were the things?
We were able to get more. Because, with one person, even though, they were only going to 13 schools that year, that's still 13 schools you got to get to. And there's at least 2 teachers at each one of those locations, and several of them more than 2. So you're trying to get each person some coaching time. And this is the first year any of them have done this. So that just the amount of coaching and amount of attention that folks could get, the teachers responded well to it. I guess I probably didn't give them credit for being in the 21st century. So, again, live and learn. We've really, we haven't been brave enough to go robot wise. That's more of a physical structure thing. But as far as the virtual coaching, we also got into virtual PLCs last year, once a month, or I guess it was once every other month. And those really ended up being some good experiences and got a lot of professional development for our teachers.
Yeah, yeah. And you were talking a little bit too, when we were discussing things about the teachers sharing what their experiences were and how that sort of peer-to-peer relationships really helped increase the buy-in in year two, coming out of that sort of pilot set of schools in the first year.
Yeah, and we did that as part of the PLCs to foster that discussion and that partnership with the year two people and the predominant year one, because the group became much more year one that second year.
Yeah.
And so that was a big piece in specifically grouping people in a way that they could have some of those peer interactions and have some of those discussions and help each other through it, which was setting the stage. I mean, it was that first little teeny step for setting the stage for much bigger things coming.
Got it. Yeah. And so in year two, it looks like I can remember we learned a lot of stuff coming out of year two, and that really fashioned a lot of what we wanted to do for the current school year that we're coming into. So maybe you can speak to a little bit of what you saw happening in year two, and how that colored what your goals were moving forward, and how what aspects shifted, what aspects you were really happy with and continued to utilize.
Yeah, so one of the things going from year one to year two that I guess I didn't necessarily realize was going to have a pretty big impact is we actually changed superintendents. Even though the new superintendent was previously in our school district, he's not somebody that I had to kind of sell this to and have him help me back it.
Yeah.
So since we had already gone down that road with the former superintendent, I didn't realize that was going to be something we would have to do. So I did learn that after year two, that I needed to make sure the superintendent understood what I needed from him. So that was a shame on me. I should have made sure to prep him for that. And so we did that this past summer. He and we also got a new chief of instruction as well. So I got those guys on board to help. And then also we really hit the principals and assistant principals hard with some buy-in talk and kind of help them understand the importance of understanding what the teachers are doing, being a part of it, and holding them accountable. Because I alluded to that a few minutes ago, that I would have kind of done that on the front end. The first year it was so small, it wasn't very obvious. The second year it became obvious when we had all these principals, that some of them just, they didn't really monitor what was going on inside their building. So fidelity was a problem. And that starts with administration and myself included, because I wasn't on them as tight as I probably should have been. And so we did present to the administrators. We had Doug Arana come in, and he did a great presentation with our folks to kind of give them a glimpse of what was the purpose, what are we trying to do, how is this going to move us forward. And we were able to tie it into the principal evaluations, and their school evaluations, because all that, they understand that really quickly.
Right.
Yeah. So we did a lot of that, and then also on my end, I made sure to set up, and I actually just last week finished my school rounds, which was pretty taxing. But I made sure to meet with the schools, with the teams, to talk about implementation, talk about the fidelity of it, problem solve with them, talk about how are they going to get the hours, remind them of that 80 to 100 minutes for the school year, and how are we going to get there? How are we going to get to that target? What are your challenges grouping people and scheduling?
And
So
and I might be jumping ahead just a little bit, Peter, but it's making me think about talk about how in year one, well, in addition to you making these rounds in year two, in year one you had somebody there from Lindamood-Bell sort of boots on the ground, and you shifted to a virtual support. How did you utilize that in terms of principal meetings and having principals bought into what it is that's happening? Because I think typically people would think you need to have somebody there who's out there meeting with the principals. Maybe you could speak to that.
no, actually, yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, we did a lot and are still doing some virtual meetings with principals and trainings with them. So that is something. Last year we began to a degree. It was an invite. You can take it if you want it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
This year it's a little more, you need to sign up for this. You need to be here this day, this time. But this has been, it's allowed some flexibility, because doing it virtually, with a boots on the ground person, again, you got those competing schedules and time frames. And so now doing it virtually, we're able to reach more administrators at a time that's more convenient for them, without taking them out of the building.
Got it. Yeah, and they can actually jump right into the session and watch some of it happening virtually as well, and then meet afterwards.
Yeah, the whisper sessions.
Yeah. Great. And so for year three, what were some of your focuses for this year coming in? I think you spoke a little bit to this, but maybe there's some.
Yeah, there's some more.
I want to talk about some more.
Definitely some more. Always more. Yeah, so we cut, I kind of alluded to this a little bit ago. The high schools jumped in last year, wanted to jump in. Out of our 3 high schools, only one of them and only one teacher ran groups. Mm-hmm. The other 2 never got off the ground. It was a little more, I think, than they realized they were going to have to be doing. And with the other things they're navigating at the high school level, I think they realized they didn't really want to participate.
Okay. Got it.
And so, that's fine. That was really my original inkling. So we cut back. They're still able to do it. We've done some in-house training, which has given us some practice for longevity's sake. So we did have some in-house practice going on, and as far as coaching folks and teaching them from our own people. But we're not tracking them the same way that we're tracking the other folks.
Yeah.
One thing I probably should have mentioned about year 2 is we did decide to partner with Winthrop University to have them run a study on the side and look and see if we could find some connections to our MAP scores. Since in South Carolina we use MAP pretty heavily for quite a few things, and so I will say we did do that, and we're doing that again this year. But kind of back to year 3, the intentional meetings, that was something that was born out of the questions and answers that came from year 2. Helping people to understand how to get to those minutes, which seems to be still a relatively difficult challenge for some teachers. And so I've had to help in those intentional individual meetings about that.
And one of the things we've talked about is we're trying to get to 80 to 120 hours of instruction for these kids, because they are exhibiting with these large deficits. And so we want to get that amount of instruction to help them really close the gaps within a given school year. And so, maybe you can talk a little bit, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about it later, about some of the challenges around teachers getting that much instructional time with students.
Yeah.
How much of it is sort of structural to the building, and maybe how much of it is teacher specific?
Yeah, and so it is actually a little bit of both of those things. You know, people have a tendency to have a construct in their mind for a schedule, regardless of what level, whether it's elementary, middle, or high, and not wanting to mix grade levels and whatnot. First grader's always got to be with a first grader, whatever, that kind of thing, and then also structurally from the teacher allotment standpoint, teachers having to be able to shoot for that 60 minutes a day. It's a pretty big number. Previously, and this is true more than just in our school district, all over the state, and I would venture to say all over the nation, people have been prescribing service minutes and IEPs based really off of nothing. And so this is something that has some science to back it up, that we can say, well, we've got these significant deficits. Here's the amount of service time we need to reduce or eliminate those deficits.
Yeah.
And so that's what I've been trying to sell to teachers, and we'll write it into the IEP. And then what happens, and I've had to explain this on an individual basis, so it's going to take time, is to let them know that allocation comes off of service time. That's a heavy weight in our school district. We don't go off of a strict head count. We use a workload formula. And because of that, the amount of service time that you have to offer students weighs heavily on how many teachers are going to be allocated to your school.
Yeah.
And so trying to get teachers to understand, you can't get help if you're only writing 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's not enough for a kid. So 30 minutes a day is not going to cut it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I imagine that's going to be a long-term challenge. Yeah.
It is, but some people have gotten a little quicker than others, and they're seeing the benefit because they've gotten some more help. But that's one of those things structurally. Also helping people understand when to pull students. A lot of folks, they feel like, oh, well, it's reading, they need to be pulled from reading. Maybe a portion of it.
Yeah.
Another, you could look at science and social studies, especially if we're talking elementary, because having been at high schools most of my career, they're going to get all of that later on. And most of those kids don't even remember that anyway. Not to poo-poo on the elementary social studies and science. It is important.
Right. Well, it does bring up the issue that it's hard for them to do social studies when they can't read what it is they're supposed to be reading anyhow.
Yeah, if you can't access it, what really are you getting out of it? Which is probably why they don't remember it by the time they get to high school.
That's another good point.
They weren't able to read it, so it's like, whatever, I'm shutting off.
Yeah.
Let me dream about whatever's going on down the road.
Yeah.
So that is one of the other pieces there. Then also this year we've kind of expanded our opportunities for support for folks as well. We're still doing PLCs, virtual PLCs, which we've expanded from elementary to secondary as well. So, because we only originally, this was a scheduling thing that we had in place before we partnered with Lindamood-Bell. We ran PLCs for our elementary resource teachers. And then, so the middle school, it was during the time that they're still teaching. Their day hasn't finished yet. So we have structured it now where we actually have a later one for them. So that's a new thing this year, and it's been wonderful. We've got office hours as well, so that teachers can pipe in, so to speak, to our folks from Lindamood-Bell and get that one-on-one time. Even if you think back to college where you might have office hours with an advisor or an instructor when you can go and talk to them one-on-one. So that kind of thing. So it's been really nice to expand how we're reaching out to folks. And with principals, we've broken up the leadership things into chunks throughout the year. So there's not one long sitting period. It's an hour here, there, and throughout the year.
Nice. Yeah, it probably makes it a little bit easier to learn and kind of digest as well. One of the other interesting things I think, Peter, we've talked a lot about, and here's where we talked about, I think, about instructional time quite a bit. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to mention in relation to that.
No, I think that covers, that pretty much covers it with those. But just being thoughtful and not being scared to group students outside of grade levels, and which really is where I really see that problem more at the elementary level. We start getting into middle school, they don't really care.
Yeah. And speaking of middle school, we've talked, I think, since year one about kind of how it's been in some ways easier to get some buy-in, or maybe another way to say is the middle schools have been really energized about doing this.
Oh, they got on it full steam from the beginning. We only had 2 middle schools in that initial year, and one of those 2 has been one of our top performers all 3 years, and they're a group that I send everybody to on a regular basis and say, hey, look, go talk to the folks at Castle Heights. Go talk to them. Interestingly enough, you didn't know this. This happened today. There's a bunch of people from around the state of South Carolina. They're at Castle Heights. They're one of the state's identified schools to watch.
Nice. Wow.
I grew up in a local district, not this school district, and back in the 80s and 90s, Castle Heights had a kind of a rough reputation. Not known academically or anything like that, but that has changed. The population hasn't changed there.
Yeah.
But the way the teachers approach things has changed. The administrators have approached, and it showed with the way they bought into Lindamood-Bell and implementing the system. But that all kind of comes from, I think, the group of teachers there notice they're getting these kids from elementary school that can't access all of this content because we're so heavy content in middle school. That's the beginning of that content heavy instruction. You're done with the building blocks. Yeah. Now we're in content. We got to get ready for high school because then those are going to actually count for some Carnegie units.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're stuck in between. So they get it. They get, oh my God, I've got to get you here, but you're way down here. How do I do this? Yeah. As you put on there, it's a blessing and a curse. You still got a little bit of time, but you don't have much.
Yeah.
You don't have much.
Well, and the issue becomes really obvious for them at that point, right? Whereas sometimes I think at elementary level, there's the belief that they're going to develop out of it.
Yeah.
And at that point, by the time they hit middle school, there's no just magically developing out of it.
Right. Yeah. It's there, and you better find some way to deal with it. So, our middle schools, I will have to say, they really jumped on board. And then when we expanded to year 2, we had, the other 3, because we have 5, they jumped in and really have been hitting it hard.
That's great. And I know we're gonna look at some of the results from one of the middle schools in just a second. So when we took a look at the students overall, your staff is now giving these students kind of what we talked about before year 1, right? That battery of assessments that's all nationally normed and is designed to really help determine have I got the right students in the right group getting the right intervention. And so, your staff gives a pretty broad battery of assessments and then utilizes that to group students. And I know we've talked about a couple of different things in here, but I don't know what you might want to highlight from this particular slide. Obviously, in the top there, that's talking about the percentiles, and light blue is how the students are coming in on their pre-test, and then the dark blue is how they're doing on their post-test. And the bottom chart just shows the standard score, so the size of the actual change from pre to post. And it's great to see that they made statistically significant gains across all of those different measures. There were some specific details I know in there that you found really interesting.
Yeah. Being a lifelong special educator, one of the things you hear a lot is you sit in IEP meetings and you hear folks talk about child can't comprehend their reading comprehension, They talk about how poor that is over and over and over and over again. And without really looking at all of the multiple parts of reading, they're looking at it from two parts only: fluency and comprehension. And then when we're doing this large battery of assessments, it's interesting to note our teachers have only just, at the end of last year and this year, gotten into VV, the visualize and verbalize, and for comprehension. They've been seeing stars, the phonemic pieces, is what they've been doing for the vast majority of these students. So they really haven't worked directly on comprehension, but comprehension had a huge increase.
Yeah.
It had a significant increase, and it kind of highlighted to me, and I've used this with teachers, is comprehension is really not a lot of these children's problems. Yes, some of them. Yeah. And are they low in comprehension? Absolutely, they're low in comprehension. But it comes really down to the root cause of it is their access, their ability to decode words, be able to make it through a sentence and actually access that literature, so they can comprehend later.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what's fascinating, as you're pointing that out, in the light blue scores and the percentiles, that comprehension and the oral directions and the vocabulary are all the highest measures for those kids, right? And these are kids whose issue really predominantly is that they can't decode. And so that's kind of the overall population of special ed students. And then we took a look at just one of the middle schools, because we were talking about how enthused they've been about it. And so this is a group of students from Dutchman Creek and how they performed last year. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what the Dutchman Creek experience was like.
Yeah, so Dutchman Creek was not in the original year. And they had a principal change from year one to year two. And the principal that came in, first year principal, and really just a strong principal in general, but really wanted to prove he belonged, but also noticed some problems when looking at his student data when he came into the school, and said, look, we got to address reading in this school. They were leaving the school, they were coming unable to read and leaving unable to read. And it was showing up on their state test and was really hitting them hard. And so he looked at the service model for their special education teachers who really weren't providing any direct instruction, or very limited. Let me change that. It was very limited direct instruction. It was almost exclusively a push-in model with more supportive instruction rather than explicit direct instruction. And this is after some talking with my director and myself and he, that we kind of coached him and said, look, if they're not able to read, and we looked at some of these pre-tests, we said, if they're not accessing, we can teach phonics, but it's got to be done explicitly, direct instruction.
Yeah.
So we did a service model change. The teachers, we talked to them about it. When they understood the concept and what was going on, as you see, there's some big differences.
Yeah, that's great. So in terms of your next step goals and moving forward, Peter, what are you thinking about now?
Well, I'm going to continue on the fidelity train. that is, I realized I have to monitor that, and then teach my principals how to monitor that.
Yeah.
So building the capacity of our school admin for monitoring for fidelity. Because if we don't do something right, how can we say whether it's really working or not? We can't really. And we say that we're making data-based decisions. Well, really, are we?
Yeah.
Well, let's make sure we practice what we preach. But then also, build the capacity for our teachers to continue instructing, continue problem solving on their own, but then also help each other and train each other. Because at some point, we're not going to be able to continue. We're gonna have other things we're going to need to spend money on. Because let's just face it, part of public education is you have a limited amount of funds, but you have a lot of projects.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure we see this through to the end and make sure it's correct. But we're going to have to, at some point, do this on our own. We're going to have to ride this bicycle without the training wheels. And although we love you guys, and you guys have been great training wheels, we're developing a core group of folks to kind of be coaches within our district and setting up structures for them to be able to coach each other. And so we're in the process of doing that pretty heavily this year.
Great. Awesome. Well, Peter, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate the time you spent with us. I think it's been valuable to everybody. Hope it has been. And everybody out there, thank you for joining us for this installment of the Lindamood-Bell Leaders in Literacy webinar. We hope to see you in another one in the future. And both Peter's contact information is there if you'd like to reach out to him. Mine is as well. And just so you know, there is also a podcast discussion that Peter engaged in that's also up on Lindamood-Bell Radio. So we'd love to have you get a chance to listen to that. And thanks again, Peter, for joining us today.
Thank you.